Hey folks, Matt Eason here, Scholar Gladiator. I hope you had a good weekend. So I am here with another one of my reviews of a Dynasty Forge sword, which they call the Oakeshott 10 or 10A, I believe they call it, the Oakeshott 10A or the Knight. Okay, so I'll refer to it as the Knight because it's a little bit less of a mouthful than the Oakeshott 10A or XA. Now, first things first, I'll just talk about that designation and that name. So the Knight is quite an appropriate name for it because it is a sort of archetypal knightly arming sword. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. But is it an Oakeshott 10A? Well, ironically, I don't think it is. So that's the first thing, is I would question, let's talk about the scabbard separately in a minute, but I would question whether this is a Type 10A. In fact, I'd go as far as to say this is not a Type 10A. I personally, and obviously Oakeshott's typology, is open to interpretation to some degree. It's not like medieval people referred to these things as Type 10s or Types 11s or whatever. It is an arming sword. It is a one-handed knightly arming sword. And I'll attribute a kind of period to this in a second. But is it a Type 10A according to Oakeshott's typology? I personally would say no. I would say it's a Type 11 or possibly a Type 12. Okay, so personally I would have called this an Oakeshott Type 11 or Type 12. It's, I would say, definitely not a 10A, but as I say, that's open to subjective opinion and interpretation. But onto the fact that it is a medieval knightly arming sword. Well, it's funny because I've spent a lot of my career, shall we say, HEMA career or sword career, looking at swords that aren't typical arming swords. I've never really focused on sword and shield or sword and buckler personally. So I've mostly looked at long swords or even, you know, falchions, messers, basically everything that wasn't a typical one-handed arming sword. That being said, I do own quite a few, as any regular viewers of this channel will know. And I have studied this thing, I have studied this period. Now, one of the things I want to say before I go into the review of this specific sword is that when we're judging how a sword handles and how it feels, its weight, its point of balance and things like this, it's very important to judge a sword within its correct context, my favourite word, and one of the things that I've talked about in previous videos is there are swords from the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries in particular, particularly the 11th and 12th centuries, less so into the 13th century, that actually don't handle or don't feel very nice by most modern sword people's perceptions of what feels nice in the hand. And the usual reason for that is because, particularly in the 12th century, you find that blades are quite long and quite hefty, and very often the point of balance is quite far from the hand. Now, funnily enough, this has a parallel with certain types of later era cavalry swords. And, you know, what we think about as handling nicely, and I'm not saying this handles badly, but I'll qualify this in a second. What we think about handling nicely is sometimes quite particular to our modern 21st century kind of opinion of how a sword feels nice in the hand when we're moving it around in the air, used by itself, completely out of a historical context, and, you know, if we're frank about it and we're looking at a sharp sword, chopping water bottles or whatever, or fencing with, okay? So if we're doing sword and buckler, for example, and we want something quite relatively nimble. Now, this is not a nimble sword, so getting into why I'm qualifying all of this, and I'm giving all this information to begin with. So a lot of swords at this period were really designed to be used with shields, and I would say from the outset that this is one of those swords. Is this a sword that I would want to be using by itself? No. Okay, it is a hefty sword. It's not massively heavy. It's about, I think it's about 1400 grams. So it's over 3 pounds. Now, historically speaking, just as a dead weight, that is at the heavy end of the spectrum for medieval arming swords, but it's not unhistorical. So it's not unreasonable, it's not unhistorical, but it is at the slightly heavier end of the spectrum. The point of balance on this sword is fairly far out for a sword of this weight. Let's have a little look at that. It balances basically 6 inches, 15 centimetres out from the crossguard. Now that's fairly far away from the hand for a sword of this weight. When I've looked at historical swords in the past that had, certainly of the, let's say of the 15th century, 14th, 15th century, which was the period that I have focused most on in the medieval period, swords that were of this kind of weight, so over 3 pounds, 3.25, 3.5 pounds, very often balanced relatively close to the hand, maybe only about 3 inches up from the crossguard. And that means that whilst the weapon is fairly hefty overall, the weight is concentrated nearer the hand and it's less of a beast to kind of handle. This sword, however, is not like that, but it is similar to, and I'm going to talk about the fact that this, I would call this a type 11 or 12 blade in a second. This is similar to swords, original medieval swords I've handled from the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries that were intended probably primarily to be used as cavalry sidearms with a big shield. So, setting all of that into context, what this is a hefty arming sword that is, in my opinion, from the handling of it, intended to be used with a shield. It can deal out very, very powerful blows, and it's not massively heavy. You can move the thing around fairly easily and fairly nimbly, but not nimbly enough to be used by itself very comfortably. Okay, so you wouldn't want to use it in the way that most Langmesters would be used, or the way that a side sword would be used, or indeed, you know, a later sabre or anything like that would be used. It does absolutely want to be used with a shield, or at least a buckler. Okay, now onto the actual sword itself. So first of all, I have sung the praises more or less, with some criticism, with some fair criticism here and there, of Dynasty Forge in the past. What they have produced here is a very nice looking product, but it's something that can be made better. So I have said pretty much in most of my reviews, and this goes for all of Dynasty products, Dynasty Forge's products, is that they are making things that are very good, but they could be that much better with some more kind of user and consumer feedback, which is, I hope, what I'm doing here. So in terms of the fit and finish, very, very good. You get a scabbard with these swords, which you don't do with other manufacturers. This incidentally comes in at about $650 US, so it's not cheap. It's not at the top end of the scale, so it's you know, relatively substantially cheaper than something from Albion, for example, but it's much more expensive than something like Windlass, for example. So it's in that kind of mid-range. It's mid-range expensive. So it is something that if you're, you know, that's the kind of amount of money you've got to play with, it might be something you want to consider. Or indeed, if you've got the money to spend on things like Albions, but you want something that's just a different design, because maybe you've got all the Albions, or you particularly like the look of this, and it is a pretty sexy shape, it has to be said, then that might be something you want to consider. In terms of the finish, fit and finish, so it is all very, very good. In terms of the construction, and I'll come back to the finish in a second. In terms of the construction, it has the same recessed nut that all of Dynasty Forge's swords that I have looked at so far have. This one is completely rock solid, there's no movement, no issues. Whether that could be a nut that's set up to be more easily tightenable, I think there's a question there. Whether indeed they maybe want to look at peened fittings instead of recessed nut, that's another question. Okay, but this is the way that they've done it at the moment. It does look like a peen, so it looks quite similar to the result that you would get from peening at the end. So it looks fairly historical, even if the construction method is not really historical for this period. In terms of the style, this is kind of, the hilt anyway, is basically kind of a 14th century, yeah, maybe 13th century at a push, late 13th, 14th century style hilt. In terms of the blade, well, it's kind of pushing it. It's kind of like a slightly earlier style blade. Now they have called this a 10A, Oakeshott type 10A. As I've said, I would personally call this a type 11, maybe a type 12, which would put it into an earlier period according to Oakeshott's own dating of things. So this would put this sword into the 1100s or 1200s, with possibly the hilt being more in the 1300s. Now that's not necessarily a problem. We know that older blades were re-hilted in later centuries, but my opinion, if I was appraising this as if it was an original antique and it had these characteristics, I would say, well, possibly an earlier blade, maybe a kind of 1200s blade on a 1300s hilt, something like this. Going back to the finish, so the one thing that Dynasty Forge, in my opinion, are getting really, really good is the finish, okay? If we look at the edge geometry, it is absolutely a single bevel straight down to a very fine edge. Now I will say on the edge, so this is the true with all Dynasty Forge swords, if you feel them, they are a very fine edge. So the edge geometry is very good, is excellent. The final sharpening is not quite there. So you can see I can run my fingers along the edge and it's not got any risk of cutting. Would I rest it against my forearm and push? No, I wouldn't. Okay, so this is sharp enough to go through water bottles when you first get it out of the box, but pretty rapidly you will want to go over this edge and give it a bit more bite with a stone or perhaps even sandpaper on a block or a belt sander or whatever. You're going to want to be able to give this edge a little bit more polishing and fine-tune that edge, but the edge geometry is there, and the finish, as you can see on the polish, the high polish, is absolutely superb, and also the grind. So looking along the blade like this, there's no rippling, the edge bevel is consistent and very well done. The fuller is very, very nicely done. It looks, as they say on their website, it looks forged rather than ground. I'm sure it's forged initially and then there's grinding which happens after the forging. That's a normal way of doing it. But it's very, very consistent. It's finished very, very nicely. The way that the fuller fades out into the flattened diamond section, superb. The midrib on the flattened diamond section is absolutely straight and defined and crisp. The way that the crossguard is cut such that the blade, the flattened diamond section, enters into the crossguard, brilliant. There's no rattle, there's no movement. In terms of the sort of oscillation, shall we say, the resonance of the blade, it has the stiff section around the center of percussion that you would want. If you wiggle the sword, then it is a sword that, in the Peter Johnson fashion, that rotates around this point, that's the cutting portion of the blade, the center of percussion. So it's got all of the physical characteristics of a hefty but very well designed and well made sword. Okay, very, very good, and as mentioned, you get a nice scabbard with it as well. So what are the things I would improve about it? Okay, so first of all, it's a lovely product. It's about $650 US, so it's not a top end price, but it's not cheap either. It is, relatively expensive. Looks great, great fit, great finish, great edge geometry, great sort of harmonics and movement and everything else. What are the down points? Well, the first down point, as you've probably guessed from the first part of my review, is it's a little bit on the hefty side. And I do think that for the majority of consumers who probably are going to use this for backyard cutting without a shield on their arm, that will probably be something that a lot of people will see as a negative. I do think that if this had a little bit more distal taper, it would be a much sweeter handling sword. So the blade starts off, I don't have a measure with me, but it's roughly about 6 or 7 millimeters thick, and it doesn't taper down a lot until you get to about there, okay? Which, with a fullered blade with almost parallel edges, is a little bit unusual. We do find blades that have almost no distal taper down here, but then they usually have profile taper this way, so they are blades that are very broad at the base and they get more pointy, they get narrower as you go along. The fact that this blade is broad, parallel edged, and doesn't have much distal taper this way means that it does handle a little bit like a bar. Now, I just want to reiterate, you do find historical swords that handle like that, because they're intended to hit with a lot of force, hitting predominantly mail armour and gambesons, and they're used with shields. So in that sense, it's the type of sword that is the most bludgeon-like but sharp. In other words, they are designed absolutely to have a lot of striking power, and you're not doing much defensively with the sword. You're mostly striking and obviously thrusting with it, with a shield used in defense. So within its context that could be fine, but I would say this would be a nicer sword for most modern people, and it would still be historical if it had more distal taper. So my opinion is, from about there downwards, there needs to be a greater amount of distal taper in the blade. That will mean the total weight of the sword will be reduced. It will mean that the point of balance will come a bit closer to the hand. It will be lighter and more nimble at the tip, and it will feel like a much more pleasant sword in the hand. That's number 1 point, needs more distal taper. Number 2 point, the minor point that I said about the sharpening. I think this is true of all Dynasty Forge swords, that they've got very good edge geometry and they're very finely made, but they just lack that final polish on the edge that would mean that they're super sharp cutting out of the box. And finally, there is one other criticism that I have, and that is about the grip leather. The grip leather is very shiny and slippery. I personally don't like that. That could be modified. Obviously, it's a grip. One of the grips are one of the easiest things for people to modify. You could even just rub beeswax all over it, which would give it a slight sticky surface. But I do think that whilst they're very nicely finished, so in terms of the way that the leather is wrapped around over cord, the leather that Dynasty Forge are using for their medieval sword grips is a little bit glossy and a little bit shiny for my tastes. And incidentally, I would also apply that to the scabbard as well. The leather, it does look like it's probably veg tanned, but it's very, very smooth. And I personally would either like a bit more texture in the string or cord underneath, or slightly wider gaps in the cord, or slightly coarser leather that's got a little bit more texture to it. Not much. It could even be that a waxed finish or something else to it helps prevent that, but as it is at the moment out of the box, it's a very slippy, slidey grip, and it's not, especially when you've got quite a hefty blade like this, it's not that easy to keep the hand in the position that you want it to be in. So, to sum up, this is a lovely sword, and I do understand that you might get the impression from what I've said here that I think it doesn't handle nicely and that there's, you know, lots of negatives. But I hope that this comes across as an honest review, because that's what I really want to give. I feel the same way about most of the Dynasty Forge swords as I do about this, and that is that they have lots of real positive things about them, but they could be made that much better. I mean, they could be top contenders in terms of replicas if they just changed a few details of the build and of the finish, or not so much the finish, but of the design, okay? So primarily things to do with distal taper, to do with the leather used, or at least the texture, and to do with that tang construction, which is not bad, but I'm not totally in love with. Finally, a totally personal and subjective point. I'm not massively keen on this pommel with this sword. To me, the pommel looks a little bit, I would use the word anemic. It looks a little bit weak for the sword overall. So it is quite a big blade. It's quite a big beefy blade and quite a dominating looking sword for an arming sword. And the pommel just to me looks a little bit weedy and a little bit small. But, you know, different strokes for different folks. Some people might love that, and that is a very personal thing. I do wonder if, especially given the way that these are constructed, if what Dynasty Forge could, especially in this price category, could offer is this blade with maybe 3 different crossguard options and 3 different pommel options, maybe even different grip options as well. Given that these unscrew and they can be swapped around at will, I do think that might be worth them looking into, and that would maybe give them something over some of their competitors as well. So there we go. Fundamentally, a very kind of dominating arming sword, probably too much for most people's taste. But if you want an arming sword that has some beef to it, but is still of historical weight and proportions and shape and look, then this is a nice sword. It is a very, very nice sword. I just think from Dynasty Forge's perspective, if they changed a few things about it, particularly about the distal taper, it could be an even better and even more popular product. I hope this review has been useful and interesting. Give us a like and a subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll see you soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.